My husband paid someone to erase me from this earth and take everything I built. A few days later, I let him believe he had won. And what I did next changed everything forever. Clara Weston walked out of the glass doors of her downtown Chicago bakery with flour still dusted on her apron and a warm smile on her face. She had spent 15 years turning a tiny kitchen dream into one of the most beloved neighborhood businesses in the city. Her cakes were famous. Her bread was legendary. But tonight, something heavy sat in her chest, something she couldn't name yet, something that had been quietly growing for months. She drove home through the familiar streets, watching the city lights blur past her window. Their home was a wide, warm house on a quiet street in Lincoln Park. She had picked out every piece of furniture herself. She had planted the roses at the front door. This was her life, her real life, the one she had worked so hard for. But when she stepped inside, Marcus, her husband, was not where he usually was. TV was off. The kitchen was cold. His jacket hung on the hook by the door, and his keys were on the counter, but the house felt strange. "Marcus," she called from the hallway. Silence. Then she heard footsteps on the stairs, slow and careful. Marcus appeared at the bottom with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was dressed like he had just come from somewhere important, not like someone who had been home all evening. "You're back early," he said, his voice smooth and even. "We finished the last batch sooner than I expected," Clara replied, watching his face carefully. "I thought maybe we could sit together tonight. Watch something. Talk." Marcus nodded, but his body language was tight, like a rubber band stretched too far. "Sure," he said, pulling out his phone already. "I'll order food. I haven't eaten yet." Clara set her bag down and watched him scroll through his phone with one hand while the other stayed buried in his pocket. Something about the way he stood made her feel like a stranger in her own house. She couldn't point to exactly what was wrong, but her stomach knew. Married people develop a kind of radar for each other, a sense of when things are off. And Clara's radar had been quietly ringing for weeks. She just hadn't let herself listen to it until now. They ate together at the kitchen table. Pizza from the place down the street. Clara tried to keep things light. "How was the meeting with the investors today?" she asked, keeping her voice casual. Marcus chewed slowly before answering. "Fine. Same old thing. Numbers and handshakes. Did anything come out of it?" He looked up for only a second. "Not yet. These things take time, Clara." She nodded. He turned back to his food. A few years ago he would have talked for an hour about a meeting like that. He used to love telling her every detail, every joke someone cracked, every deal that almost fell apart. Now he gave her 3 words and went back to eating like she wasn't there. They finished dinner without much more conversation. Marcus said he was tired and went upstairs. Clara cleaned up the kitchen slowly, her mind turning over every small thing she had noticed lately. The late nights. The hushed phone calls he always took in the garage. The way he sometimes looked at her, not with love, not even with indifference, but with something that felt more like calculation. She dried her hands on the dish towel and stood still in the quiet kitchen for a long time. Then she saw it. His phone. Face down on the edge of the counter. He had forgotten it. Clara stared at it for a moment. She had never been the kind of woman to snoop. She believed in trust. She had always believed in trust. But trust and instinct are 2 different things, and right now her instinct was louder than anything else in the room. She picked up the phone. She knew his code. His mother's birthday. She typed it in and went straight to his messages. Most were normal. Work contacts. His brother. Few group chats. Then she saw a name that made her breath catch. The contact was saved simply as R. The last message read, "Confirmed for Thursday. No loose ends." Clara read it 3 times. Her hands felt cold. What was confirmed? What did no loose ends mean? She closed the app and set the phone back exactly where it had been, face down on the counter. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She walked to the living room and sat down in the dark, not turning on any lights, just sitting there with the city glow coming through the curtains. Thursday was 2 days away. The next morning, Clara called her closest friend, Denise, and asked to meet for coffee before the bakery opened. Denise arrived in her usual bright scarf and big earrings, full of energy, full of warmth. But the moment she sat down across from Clara, her smile faded. "What happened?" she asked quietly. Clara wrapped both hands around her mug. "I don't know yet. That's the problem." She told Denise everything. The message, the coldness, the way Marcus had been acting for months. Denise listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When Clara finished, Denise leaned forward and said, "You need to take this seriously, Clara. Not tomorrow. Today." "I don't have proof of anything," Clara whispered. "I have a strange message and a bad feeling." "Sometimes that's enough to start paying attention," Denise said firmly. She reached across the table and squeezed Clara's hand. "You are smart and strong and you built everything you have from nothing. Don't let anyone take that from you. Not even him." Clara nodded, but the fear still sat heavy on her chest. Going home that night felt different. Like walking into a place she no longer fully understood. That evening, Clara pretended everything was normal. She made Marcus his favorite meal, lamb chops with roasted garlic potatoes, and they sat together at the dining table like any other night. But she watched him more carefully now. The way he checked his phone under the table twice. The way his jaw tightened when she asked what he had planned for Thursday. "Business," he said. "Nothing exciting." He smiled at her. He smiled back. And in that moment, sitting across from the man she had married 11 years ago, Clara understood that she was completely alone in this house. That night, she lay beside him in the dark and listened to him breathe until his breathing slowed and deepened into sleep. Then she quietly got out of bed, walked barefoot to the kitchen, and sat at the table with a glass of water. She opened her laptop and began researching. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for. She just knew she needed information. She looked up Marcus's business contacts, his recent transactions through their shared account, the name of the investment firm he had been meeting with. Piece by piece, small things began to feel less like coincidences. There were withdrawals she hadn't noticed before. Not large enough to be alarming on their own, but added together they were significant. There were charges from hotels in cities Marcus had told her he hadn't visited. And there was a name that kept showing up in business documents she found online. A man named Reginald Thorne. She searched his name and found very little. Small picture. A vague LinkedIn profile. But his face gave her a chill she couldn't explain. She closed the laptop and sat in the silence of her kitchen. Thursday was tomorrow. Whatever was going to happen, it was close. She didn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Marcus slept peacefully beside her. By the time the sun came up, Clara had made a quiet decision. She was not going to wait and see what happened to her. She was going to find out what was being planned and she was going to be ready. She got up, made coffee, and acted like everything was completely normal. She kissed Marcus on the cheek before he left for his so-called meeting. He smiled at her with that easy smile she used to love. "I'll be back by dinner," he said. She waved from the doorway. She already knew she had to move fast. At the bakery that morning, Clara pulled Denise aside and told her she needed help. Not just emotional support this time. Real help. Denise had a cousin named Troy who was a private investigator. Clara had met him once at a birthday party years ago. He seemed quiet and sharp. Exactly the kind of person she needed right now. Denise made the call while Clara was handling the morning rush. By the time the croissants were out of the oven, Troy had agreed to meet them during the lunch break. Clara moved through the morning with a strange kind of focus. Fear had turned into something more useful. Troy arrived at the bakery just after noon, dressed plainly in a gray jacket and dark jeans. He had the kind of face that didn't stand out in a crowd, which Clara suspected was probably useful in his line of work. He sat down with a cup of coffee Clara poured for him and listened carefully as she told him everything. He didn't react dramatically. He just nodded slowly and asked a few precise questions. The contact name in the phone. Just the letter R. Yes, Clara said. Reginald. I found that name in his business documents. Troy looked up. Something shifted in his expression. Reginald Thorne, he asked. Clara blinked. You know him. Troy set down his coffee cup. I've heard the name. He's not someone you want connected to your life. He didn't say more than that, but his tone said everything. Clara felt the room tilt slightly. Whatever she had suspected, the reality was beginning to feel much larger and much more dangerous. Troy told her he would look into things quietly and carefully. In the meantime, he said, looking at her directly, be careful what you say at home. Be normal. Don't let him know you're looking. Clara nodded. She was already ahead of him on that. Thursday came. Marcus left early, telling Clara he had an all-day meeting across town. She waited 15 minutes after he drove away, then called Troy. He had already been watching. He went to a parking garage on Wacker, Troy said over the phone. Met with a man for about 12 minutes. I got photos. Clara closed her eyes. And the man? I'll need to confirm, but it looks like our friend Reginald. She sat down on the kitchen floor, back against the cabinet, phone pressed to her ear. The marble was cold against her legs. Okay, she said quietly. What do we do now? Troy told her not to panic. He told her that knowing was better than not knowing, and that they had time to be smart about this. But he also told her something she hadn't expected. Clara, I think you need to disappear for a little while. She didn't understand at first. What do you mean disappear? I mean, Troy said carefully, if something is being planned and you're still in plain sight, you're vulnerable. But if whoever is involved believes the situation is already resolved, they stop watching. They get careless. And that's when we can really see what's going on. It took Clara a full day to understand what Troy was suggesting. He wasn't talking about running away. He was talking about creating the appearance of something terrible having already happened. He was talking about making Marcus and anyone working with him believe that whatever they had planned had already been carried out. The idea was terrifying and brilliant at the same time. Clara spent that evening thinking it through from every angle. If she disappeared without a trace, Marcus would believe he had gotten what he paid for. He would relax. He would make mistakes. And Troy would be watching every single one of them. The hardest part was telling Denise. Clara met her at the park the following morning, away from cameras and ears. Denise sat very still as Clara explained what she and Troy were thinking. Then she covered her mouth with her hand. Clara, this is not a movie, she whispered. I know, Clara said. But neither is what Marcus is doing. Denise looked at her for a long time. Then she said, what do you need from me? That was the moment Clara knew she could actually do this. With Denise and Troy beside her, with the anger and the clarity that had replaced her fear, she began to make a plan. Troy had connections. He knew a woman who ran a small, off-the-books shelter for people in exactly these kinds of situations. Women who needed to vanish for a while for their own safety. He arranged for Clara to stay there under a different name. She would leave her phone behind. She would take only cash. She would tell no one else. Not her employees. Not her sister. Not anyone who might accidentally say the wrong thing to the wrong person. For the plan to work, the disappearance had to be convincing. And to be convincing, it had to feel real even to the people who loved her. The night before she left, Clara walked through her house slowly. She ran her hand along the kitchen counter where she had made thousands of meals. She stood in the doorway of the room where she kept her recipe books, her notes, the little sketches she made when she was dreaming up new cakes. She was not saying goodbye to her life. She was protecting it. That was what she told herself as she packed a small bag, tucked it under the bed, and lay down next to Marcus one last time. He was watching something on his phone with earbuds in. He didn't notice her crying quietly in the dark. The next morning, everything went exactly as planned. Clara drove to the bakery as usual, parked her car in its usual spot, left her phone on the front seat, and walked 2 blocks to where Troy was waiting. She got into his car without looking back. They drove in silence for a while. Then Troy said, You're doing the right thing. Clara watched the city pass by through the window. I know, she said. It just doesn't feel like it yet. Troy nodded. It will, he said. Give it time. They reached the shelter by mid-morning. Clara stepped out of the car and into her temporary invisible life. Back at the house, Marcus came home to silence. Clara's car was gone. Her phone went straight to voicemail. He called twice then stopped. Troy had planted a source nearby, a quiet neighbor who reported that Marcus didn't seem panicked. He seemed to be waiting, which told Troy everything he needed to know. Marcus wasn't worried because he had been expecting this. He was just waiting for confirmation. That confirmation came 2 days later when a man appeared at Marcus's door. Troy caught it all on a tiny camera he had placed on the street weeks earlier. The man handed Marcus a sealed envelope. Marcus opened the door wider and let the man inside. They were together for less than 10 minutes. When the man left, Marcus stood on his front steps for a moment, looked up at the sky, and then went back inside. Troy sent the footage to Clara that evening through a secure message. She watched it on a tablet in the small room at the shelter. She sat on the edge of the bed with the tablet in her hands and watched her husband receive what she could only assume was confirmation that his plan had worked. She watched him look at the sky, like a man who had just been freed. That night, Clara allowed herself to feel it. The grief of it. The absolute shock of loving someone and discovering that you were never as safe as you believed. She cried for a long time in that small quiet room. The woman who ran the shelter, a calm and steady woman named Ruth, brought her a cup of tea and sat nearby without saying anything. Sometimes presence is the greatest comfort. When Clara finally stopped crying, she felt something settle inside her. Not peace exactly. Something harder than peace. Something that would carry her through what came next. Over the following days, Troy began pulling on every thread he could find. He had contacts in the financial world and asked quiet questions about Marcus's recent business dealings. What came back was worse than Clara had imagined. Marcus had been quietly moving money for months. Not just their shared savings. The bakery's accounts. Investment funds that had Clara's name on them. He had been building himself an exit. An exit that required her to no longer be part of the picture. And the man helping him do it, Reginald Thorne, had done this kind of thing before. Troy dug into Reginald's background carefully. The man had no clean public record. But in certain private circles, he was known as someone who handled difficult transitions for wealthy clients. It was a polished and horrible phrase for something completely criminal. Troy brought everything he had found to a contact of his at the FBI field office, a woman named Special Agent Diane Marsh, who had been quietly investigating financial crimes connected to a larger network for over a year. When Troy laid out what he had on Marcus and Reginald, Agent Marsh leaned back in her chair and said, "We've been looking for this connection." Clara was brought into the conversation carefully. Agent Marsh met with her at a neutral location, a coffee shop 2 towns away. She was direct and professional, and she spoke to Clara the way someone speaks to a person who is both a victim and a key piece of something much larger. "We need your help," Agent Marsh said. "But only if you're willing. And only if you understand that this will be difficult." Clara looked at her. "I've already been doing difficult," she said quietly. "Tell me what you need." Agent Marsh smiled, just slightly, the way someone smiles when they're relieved they found the right person. The plan they built together was careful and layered. Clara would remain hidden while Troy continued gathering evidence. Agent Marsh would monitor the financial movements and build the legal case. And at the right moment, Clara would come back. Not as a victim. As someone who had watched and waited and gathered everything they needed. Marcus would not know what hit him until it was far too late. For now, the most important thing was patience. Clara was not naturally a patient person. She was a baker. She was used to making things happen with her hands. Waiting felt foreign and uncomfortable. But she used the time well. During those quiet days at the shelter, she began writing things down. Everything she could remember. Every strange conversation. Every unexplained trip. Every moment she had pushed her instincts aside and chosen to believe the easier story. She filled a notebook with details, dates, and descriptions. She wrote about the night she found the message on his phone. She wrote about the dinner when he brought home that envelope. She wrote about all the small moments when she had sensed something was wrong and told herself she was imagining it. She was not imagining it. She had never been imagining it. Ruth, the woman who ran the shelter, checked in on Clara every morning. She never pushed her to talk, but when Clara wanted to speak, Ruth always had time. One morning over breakfast, Clara asked her how many women had passed through this place. Ruth thought for a moment. "Many," she said simply. "Too many." Clara looked down at her coffee. "Do they usually come out okay on the other side?" Ruth looked at her steadily. "The ones who stay brave," she said. "Always do." Clara didn't say anything else. She just nodded and went back to writing in her notebook. That afternoon, Troy sent her an update. Marcus had filed a missing person report. Clara had expected it, but seeing the words still hit her like cold water. He had stood in a police station and reported her missing. He had spoken to officers with that smooth, concerned voice of his. He had probably looked exactly like a worried husband. She read Troy's message 3 times and then set the tablet down. There was something deeply unsettling about watching a person perform grief for you while you were still alive. But Agent Marsh had been prepared for this. The local police had been quietly informed that the case was connected to an ongoing federal investigation. They were told to handle the report normally without disclosing anything, without alerting Marcus that anything unusual was happening. It was a delicate dance, but it held. Marcus continued to believe that the world had accepted his version of events. He even gave a brief interview to a local news station, standing in front of their house with hollow eyes and a trembling voice, asking the public for any information about his missing wife. Clara watched the clip on the tablet in her shelter room. She sat through all 90 seconds of it without blinking. Then she closed it and went back to her notebook. 2 weeks into her disappearance, something unexpected happened. A woman contacted the FBI tip line with information related to Reginald Thorne. Her name was Sylvia. She said she had worked as an assistant in a financial consulting office connected to Thorne's network. She said she had seen things she couldn't stay quiet about any longer. Agent Marsh brought Sylvia in carefully. And what Sylvia shared opened up a much wider picture. Reginald Thorne wasn't just helping wealthy spouses disappear their partners for inheritance money. He was running a network. A quiet, professional, and deeply criminal network that had been operating for years. Clara was told about Sylvia's information during a call with Agent Marsh. She sat on the edge of the shelter bed, pressing the phone to her ear and listening carefully. "How many people?" Clara asked when Agent Marsh paused. "We're still counting," the agent said. "But Clara, what you stumbled into is much bigger than just your husband and one bad man." Clara breathed slowly. She had walked out of her regular life carrying a small bag and a terrible suspicion. She had not expected to land in the middle of something like this. But here she was. And she was not going to look away. Over the following days, the investigation expanded. Troy worked closely with the FBI team, sharing everything he had collected. The footage, the financial records, the timeline of Marcus's meetings with Thorne. Agent Marsh's team worked from their end, tracing the money, mapping the network, identifying other potential victims. It was slow and painstaking work. And through all of it, Clara stayed hidden and waited. She started helping in small ways. She remembered names Marcus had mentioned in passing over the years. Business contacts she had met at events. She shared these with Agent Marsh, and more than once, a name she offered turned out to be a thread worth pulling. One evening Troy came to the shelter in person for the first time since dropping her off. He sat across from her in Ruth's small sitting room and spread several photographs on the coffee table. "I need you to look at these," he said. Clara leaned forward. The photos showed a man she had never seen before. Heavy-set, gray-haired, wearing expensive clothes in each image, always slightly blurred like Troy had shot them from far away. "Who is he?" she asked. "His name is Gerald Foss," Troy said. "He's Thorne's connection to the money. He's the top of the chain." Clara studied the photographs carefully. "Have I ever seen him?" she asked. Troy nodded slowly. "Once," he said. He laid down one more photograph. It was taken at a charity gala she and Marcus had attended about a year ago. She was in the background of the photo, laughing at something with a glass of wine in her hand. Marcus was in the foreground, shaking hands with Gerald Foss. Clara stared at the image for a long time. She had been right there, standing just a few feet away from the man at the top of something terrible. And she had had no idea. She closed her eyes for a moment and then opened them again. "We need to connect Marcus directly to Foss," Agent Marsh said during their next call. "We have Thorne in the middle, but for the case to be airtight, we need evidence that Marcus knew exactly who he was working with and what the operation involved." Clara thought about this carefully. She knew Marcus. She knew how he operated. He was not careless with written messages, but he was careless with pride. He liked to feel smart. He liked to feel powerful. And people who like feeling powerful almost always have moments where they say more than they should to someone they think is beneath them. She remembered his assistant, a young man named Patrick who had worked for Marcus for 3 years. Patrick had always been friendly to Clara. He had sent her a nice message when her bakery won a local award. He was observant and he paid attention. She mentioned his name to Troy. Troy raised an eyebrow. "You think he knows something?" "I think," Clara said slowly, "that Marcus probably said things in front of Patrick that he wouldn't say in front of me. Marcus thought I was the most important person in the room. Patrick was invisible to him." Troy nodded. "I'll look into it." Troy reached out to Patrick through a mutual contact very carefully. Patrick was nervous at first. He didn't know what had happened to Clara. He had seen the news report about her disappearance and been disturbed by it. But when Troy explained that Clara was safe and that his information could be critically important, Patrick agreed to meet. He told them that in the weeks before Clara disappeared, he had overheard a phone call in Marcus's office. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. Business talk, numbers, logistics. But one phrase had stayed with him. "Make sure nothing points back to the source." Patrick had written it down on a post-it note almost without thinking and then stuck it inside his desk drawer and more or less forgotten about it. He still had it. Troy asked him to hold on to it and not tell anyone. Patrick agreed immediately. The information combined with everything else they already had was starting to form a very solid picture. Agent Marsh's team was now ready to begin moving toward the next phase. The investigation had taken shape. Now it was almost time for Clara to come back from the dead. Not literally, of course, but close enough to matter. The plan for Clara's return was mapped out over 2 careful meetings with Agent Marsh and Troy. Could not be sudden. Had to be controlled. They needed Marcus to react in a way that revealed things rather than allowed him to retreat. Agent Marsh proposed that Clara appear somewhere public, somewhere Marcus was known to go. The moment he saw her alive, his reaction would tell them a great deal. And more importantly, the people watching him would catch every word, every call, every move he made in the hours that followed. Clara listened to all of this and agreed without hesitation. The chosen location was a restaurant Marcus visited every Thursday for lunch with a small group of business associates. It was a habit he had kept for years, long before any of this began. Clara knew the place well. She had eaten there with him dozens of times. The plan was simple on the surface. She would walk in. She would sit down at a table across the room. And she would wait for him to see her. What happened after that was up to him. Agent Marsh's team would be in position throughout the restaurant. Troy would be outside. And Clara would be wearing a small recording device beneath her blouse. The night before, Clara sat with Ruth in the shelter kitchen and drank tea. Ruth asked her how she was feeling. Clara thought about it honestly. "Scared," she said. "But also ready." Ruth nodded. Those two things usually go together when something important is about to happen, she said. Clara smiled for the first time in weeks. A real smile, not a performance. She went to bed early and actually slept, which surprised her. She dreamed of her bakery. The smell of bread in the morning. The sound of the mixers. The easy rhythm of a life she understood. She woke up determined to get it back. Thursday arrived gray and cool. Clara dressed carefully in clothes she had not worn in weeks, something she had packed in that small bag the night before she left. She looked in the small mirror in the shelter bathroom for a long time. She looked like herself, slightly thinner, steadier somehow in the eyes, like someone who had been through something and come out the other side still standing. She said goodbye to Ruth with a long hug. Ruth told her to be safe and to come back and tell her how it ended. Clara promised she would. Then she got into Troy's car and they drove toward the restaurant together in silence. They parked a block away. Agent Marsh checked in through a small earpiece Troy wore. Everything was in position. Marcus and his group had already been seated inside, confirmed by one of the agents already in the restaurant. Clara took a slow breath. "You ready?" Troy asked. She looked at the restaurant door. 11 years of marriage. All those mornings making coffee together. All those nights talking about dreams. All of it sitting on one side of a scale, and the truth of what he had done sitting on the other. "Yes," she said. She got out of the car and walked toward the door. She walked in calmly. The hostess smiled and offered to seat her. "I'll sit myself, thank you," Clara said pleasantly. She chose a table near the window with a clear sight line across the restaurant. She sat down, picked up the menu, and allowed herself to settle. Took 4 minutes. She was on her second sip of water when she heard the sound of a chair scraping hard against the floor across the room. She looked up. Marcus had risen halfway out of his seat. His face had gone completely white. His mouth was open. The men at his table were looking at him with confusion. Clara met his eyes and did not look away. For a long moment nothing moved. Then Marcus sat back down very slowly, like a man trying to control every muscle in his body. His table-mates went back to their conversation. But Clara watched him pull out his phone under the table and begin typing rapidly. In her earpiece, she heard Agent Marsh say quietly, "He's messaging someone. We've got it." Clara returned her gaze to her menu. Her heart was pounding, but her hands were completely still. She ordered a salad and a sparkling water from the waitress who came by. She ate slowly and calmly and stayed for exactly 40 minutes, then paid her bill and left. The messages Marcus sent during that lunch were exactly what Agent Marsh's team needed. In his panic, he had been careless in a way he never would have been under normal circumstances. He had messaged Reginald Thorne directly from his personal phone. He had used names. He had used language that removed all possible doubt about his intent and his knowledge. He had essentially handed them the final piece. Troy was grinning when Clara got back into the car. "That was it," he said. "Marsh says they have everything they need." Clara buckled her seatbelt. She didn't feel like grinning. She felt like crying again, but in a completely different way. The arrests were coordinated for the following morning to avoid anyone having time to flee or destroy evidence. Agent Marsh's team moved on Marcus at the house, on Reginald Thorne at his office building, and on Gerald Foss at an airport where he was attempting to board a flight under a different name. Clara was not present for any of it. She watched updates come through on Troy's phone at a diner where they sat with cups of coffee and waited. When Agent Marsh confirmed that all 3 had been taken into custody without incident, Clara set down her coffee cup very carefully. Her hands were finally completely still. But there was one more thing. One more piece of the story that Clara had not expected, had not even suspected, and that would turn out to be the most painful part of everything she had endured. It came to light 2 days after the arrests, when federal investigators began going through Gerald Foss's private records. Buried deep in a series of financial transfers was a name that stopped Agent Marsh in her tracks. She called Troy immediately. Troy sat with the information for several hours before he came to Clara. He knocked on the door of the shelter room where she was staying a few more days while things settled. He sat across from her and his face was serious in a way she hadn't seen before, even through all of this. "I have to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear it fully before you respond." Clara put down the book she'd been reading and looked at him. "Tell me." Troy took a breath. There was a name in Foss's financial records. Someone who received payments related to the plan against you. He paused. "Someone you know." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. The list of people she trusted was already so small. She looked at Troy and waited. "It's your brother-in-law," Troy said. "Marcus's brother. Daniel." Clara stared at him. Daniel, who had been at their wedding. Daniel, who came to the bakery every Christmas and ate half a dozen cookies while she wrapped up the rest for him to take home. Daniel, who had texted her after the missing person report went out and said he hoped she was somewhere safe. She stood up and walked to the window and looked at the parking lot outside without really seeing it. Then she said very quietly, "How involved was he?" Troy told her what the records showed. Daniel had not planned anything. He had known. He had received money for his silence, for not asking questions, for being available if anyone needed confirmation of certain things. He had not hired anyone or arranged anything. But he had known that something was being planned against Clara, and he had taken money to stay quiet. In the eyes of the law, that made him part of it. Clara listened to all of this from the window. When Troy finished, she turned around and sat back down on the edge of the bed. She looked at her hands in her lap. "Okay," she said finally. "Then that's what it is." Troy nodded slowly. "I'm sorry, Clara." Daniel was picked up the following day. Clara didn't ask for details. She asked only to know when it was confirmed. When Troy sent her the message, she was in the shelter kitchen making herself breakfast. She read it and set the phone down on the counter and kept scrambling her eggs. She ate alone at the small kitchen table. She thought about Daniel at their wedding. She thought about all the holiday cookies. Then she thought about the fact that he had known someone wanted to erase her from the world, and he had cashed a check instead of picking up a phone. She finished her breakfast and washed the plate. Agent Marsh gave Clara a thorough update in person that afternoon. The case was strong. The evidence was overwhelming. The federal prosecutors were confident. All four men, Marcus, Reginald Thorne, Gerald Foss, and Daniel, would be facing serious charges. Clara would be called to testify. That was unavoidable. But Agent Marsh assured her that the process would be handled carefully, and that Clara would have support throughout. Clara sat in the chair across from the agent and listened and nodded and asked practical questions. Inside she was a woman rebuilding herself one small quiet brick at a time. Before the legal process fully began, there was one more meeting Clara had not planned for. A woman reached out through a lawyer, requesting to speak with Clara privately. Her name was Miriam. She was Reginald Thorne's estranged sister. She had no involvement in any of the criminal activity, but she had been watching her brother's life from a distance for years, sick with worry, unsure what to do. She had information. Not about the case against Clara but about other women. Other situations. Other cases from years past that had never been investigated because no one had known to look. Clara agreed to the meeting. Miriam arrived looking exhausted in a way that went beyond sleep. She sat across from Clara and said the first thing she said was, "I'm so sorry. For all of it. I should have spoken sooner." Clara looked at her. "Why didn't you?" Miriam looked down. "Because I was afraid. Because he's my brother and I kept hoping I was wrong." Clara nodded slowly. She understood fear. She understood the way it can make you stay still when you should be moving. "Tell me about the other women," she said. And Miriam did. For nearly 2 hours Miriam talked. Clara listened and wrote everything down. She passed Miriam's information to Agent Marsh the following morning. The agent's eyes moved quickly across the pages Clara had filled in her notebook. "This is going to open up additional investigations," Agent Marsh said. "It could take years." "It should take whatever it takes," Clara said. Agent Marsh looked at her for a moment. You know, most people in your position would just want to get through their own case and move on. You're still thinking about everyone else. Clara shrugged slightly. Someone should. Agent Marsh nodded. There was nothing more to say. The work was what mattered now. And there was a great deal of it. The weeks before the trial were difficult in a way that was completely different from hiding in the shelter. This difficulty was public. Her name was in the news. Her bakery was mentioned in articles. People she barely knew had opinions about her life. Former customers left supportive messages on the bakery's social media page. Few left ugly ones. Clara read none of them. Denise managed the bakery's accounts and shielded her from the noise as much as possible. Clara focused on her testimony on her notebook and on the steady rhythm of baking, which she had returned to because it grounded her in a way nothing else did. The morning of the first day of trial, Clara sat in the car outside the courthouse for 10 minutes before going in. Troy was beside her. Denise was waiting on the courthouse steps. She had worn a bright red scarf, which Clara suspected was entirely intentional. A beacon of color in a gray day. Clara walked up the steps and Denise fell into step beside her without saying a word. She just looped her arm through Clara's and they walked through the door together. Inside, the room was full and formal and heavy with the weight of everything that had brought them all to this point. Clara took her seat beside the prosecutors. She looked straight ahead. She did not look at Marcus. She was not ready to look at Marcus yet. The judge entered. The proceedings began. The lead prosecutor opened with a clear and powerful statement laying out everything that had happened. Every financial transaction. Every recorded message. Every meeting caught on camera. Every piece of evidence that Troy and Agent Marsh's team had spent weeks gathering. Clara heard her own name spoken aloud many times in ways that felt both deeply personal and strangely distant, like a story about someone she knew well. When the recordings were played, the room went very still. Marcus's voice filled the courtroom from a speaker. Clara listened to him discuss her, casually, coldly, like a problem to be managed. She felt the jury react. She felt the room shift. And still she kept her gaze forward, her hands folded quietly in her lap, her breathing slow and even. When Daniel's financial records were presented, she looked briefly at the table where he was seated. He did not look up. She looked away. When Reginald Thorne's history was laid out in careful detail, she heard murmuring in the gallery behind her. She did not turn around. On the day she testified, Clara walked to the stand and looked at the jury and told the truth. All of it. From the first strange feeling in her kitchen on that quiet evening to the moment she walked into the restaurant and watched the color drain from her husband's face. She spoke plainly and clearly. She did not perform sadness and she did not hide it either. She simply told what had happened and what she had done and why. She spoke for almost 3 hours. When she stepped down, the prosecutor nodded at her. That small nod said everything it needed to. The trial took several weeks. Then came the day of the verdicts. Clara sat still as the judge read each decision. Marcus Weston, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and financial fraud, sentenced to 22 years in federal prison with no possibility of early release. Clara exhaled once, slowly. Reginald Thorne, guilty on all counts, including racketeering and conspiracy, sentenced to 28 years in federal prison. Gerald Foss, guilty of racketeering, conspiracy, and fraud, sentenced to 32 years in federal prison. Daniel Weston, guilty of conspiracy and concealment, sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Clara heard each sentence as it was delivered. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something quieter and more solid than triumph. She felt like the ground under her feet was real again, firm and reliable in a way it had not been since the night she found that message on Marcus's phone. She stood up when it was over and walked out of the courtroom with Troy on one side and Denise on the other. Reporters called questions from behind the barriers outside. She walked past all of them without stopping. There was nothing she needed to say to a camera. Everything had already been said where it mattered. In the months that followed, Clara rebuilt slowly and deliberately. She returned to the bakery not as an escape from life but as the center of it. She hired 2 new bakers. She renovated the back kitchen. She added a small coffee counter near the window that faced the street. Regular customers came back. New ones found their way in. The work of making good things with her hands remained exactly what it had always been. Honest and warm and real. She began mentoring other small business owners in the neighborhood, particularly women who were starting from very little and needed someone who understood that journey. She kept in touch with Agent Marsh, who updated her as the broader investigation moved forward and identified more victims connected to Thorne's network. She wrote letters that she never sent to Miriam, always meaning to reach out and thank her properly. She did eventually. Miriam wrote back and they continued to correspond in a quiet way. 2 women bound by something neither had chosen and both had survived. Clara also kept Ruth's number in her phone and called her on the anniversary of the day she had first arrived at the shelter. Ruth answered on the second ring and said, "I knew you'd call." One evening near the end of autumn, Clara locked up the bakery and stood on the sidewalk outside for a moment. The street was lit softly. There was the smell of cold air and something warm from the restaurant next door. She looked at the bakery window, at the soft glow inside, at her own name written in the glass. This was hers. Had always been hers. No one had taken it. She had made sure of that. She pulled her coat around her shoulders and walked to her car. There were things ahead she hadn't figured out yet, but the ground beneath her was solid. And she was ready. Did you enjoy today's story? I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me which moment hit you the hardest. If this story moved you, show some love by hitting that like button and sending a super thanks. It truly means the world and helps Auntie keep these stories coming. You'll see 2 more incredible life stories on your screen right now. Go watch them, you won't regret it. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story. This is Auntie's Stories, where real emotion meets real storytelling. See you in the next one with so much love.